transformation of conflict in fragile settings. So let me turn now to the three forms of conflict that constitute a heuristic device for understanding the differences in the nature of conflict in cities, and that emerged out of our review of the literature. We frame our discussion in relation to three concepts: antagonism or contestation, conflict, and here we refer mainly to violent conflict, and engagement. So antagonism or contestation would be part and parcel of social life in cities, and something we would welcome. Conflict, or violent conflict, happens when that is not engaged with through generative, what we call generative forms of engagement. We then talk about three kinds of conflict. Sovereign conflict refers to situations where international actors are directly and explicitly involved in warfare. So this could be, for example, the most obvious example would be Baghdad, the involvement of foreign powers in Baghdad or in Iraq or in Afghanistan. So sovereign wars are where international actors are within the sovereign space of another of a country and interfering. What's the relationship between cities and sovereign conflict? Well, cities are affected in so much as they almost invariably involve attempts to capture and control the capital city. And capital cities are what we would call significant territory. Significant territory that you have to get. So if you think about sovereign conflicts, some of them, once they've got the capital city, the rest of the country can go hang. And so cities are very firmly pulled into conflicts, sovereign conflicts in that way. This is because capital cities are generally the seat of executive authority, the site of economic wealth, and the centre of political power, and as such, they have symbolic and leverage value. Civil conflict can be taken to refer to violent conflict between two or more relatively organised groups within sovereign boundaries. The parties to the conflict are politically and militarily organised within sovereign boundaries. The government is generally a principal combatant. One or more of the groups must be seeking to take control of the state or part of the state, and the weaker party must be able to mount effective resistance to the stronger party over a sustained period for it to be called a civil war. Now, the role of cities in relation to civil war or civil conflict is interesting because they are most easily fought from rural spaces. And if you think of the anti-colonial struggles, for example, which were civil wars, they would very much be part of what Eric Wolff called peasant wars or civil wars of the 20th century. And cities were not really part of it. However, what we've seen in Africa, for example, is that civil wars have had a dramatic impact on cities, and the ones that most clearly come to mind are Kinshasa, which was one of our case study cities, and Luanda, which wasn't. But here, in both cases, you have a massive growth of the urban population, rapid urbanization as a result of war going on in the surrounding countryside. In Kinshasa, Bill Freund, who wrote one of the papers that did one of the case studies informing our work, talks about Kinshasa as an island of calm in a war-torn country. And as I say, Antonio Pistosi talks about cities in Afghanistan as the eye of the storm. War all around, and cities as places where nothing nothing is touched. And that can be for a number of reasons. It can be because the urban elites, or the, not necessarily urban elites, but the elites involved in the conflict live in the cities and want to keep them safe. It could be that the end goal of civil war is very often the capture of the city, as with sovereign city, and so it comes at the end. And so cities sometimes serve as places of refuge, of relative security. They become economic hubs in war economies, and Goma, which was one of our other case studies in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a classic example of a city that's become the hub of a regional trade network and a war economy. Or they can become sites of combat, particularly when civil conflict overlaps with civic conflict. So what do we mean by civic conflict? Civic conflict we take to refer to the diverse but current forms of violence between individuals and groups that take place in cities. Although civic conflict can spill beyond cities and can be common and part of civil and sovereign conflicts, civic conflict, as the name suggests, is fundamentally urban in nature. Types of civic conflict could include violent crime, gang warfare, terrorist acts, religious and sectarian riots, spontaneous rebellions, or violent protests over civic issues, for example, poor or absent service delivery and other state failures. Civic conflict differs from civil conflict or civil war in that it's more narrowly specified spatially, and ultimately it's a reactive process. Unlike civil conflict, which can be thought of as essentially instrumental, civic conflict can be both expressive and involve attempts to reconfigure power relations. It's not about taking control of formal structures or power, but about signalling to them. And this is clearly encapsulated in Jason's work on Maputo, when he observes about the riots that broke out in February 2008, and I'd be interested to see if you still thought the same about the 2010 ones, Jason. It seemed that the rioters were more intent on reminding Frelimo that they also shared the city and were suffering, rather than being aimed at overthrowing the regime. So civic conflict can ultimately be seen as the violent expression of grievances vis-à-vis the state or other actors. So this tripart construct provides a heuristic device, as opposed to a typology or an absolute classificatory system, for analysing the ways in which different forms of conflict intersect with urban centres. And we found it to be an effective framework for identifying similarities and differences and shifts and trends in relation to global trends and warfare. So through this analytical lens, we were able to offer fresh perspectives on the interactions between these different forms of conflict and cities, and then how these in turn impact on questions of state fragility. How long have I got?
Another 25 minutes.
I'm going to just go through some of the case studies to illustrate some of the points I make, because I think that that's sort of at quite a high level of abstraction. So to try and put flesh on the bones, if you like, give you some ideas of how we got there through the actual empirical research. So what Ajahn Pajarai talks about the implosion of global and national politics into the urban world. And I think this is a really interesting concept, because so much of what we discovered in sovereign conflicts, where you had international presence and involvement, was the implosion of global and national conflicts into the urban world. And I think a really interesting example here is Kabul in Afghanistan, where I did some work myself, which is referred to in the paper, but also where Daniel Esser, who was one of the PhD students associated with the program, did a fascinating comparative PhD looking at Sierra Leone and Freetown, and Kabul in Afghanistan. And Daniel's work on Kabul explored the way in which international involvement in reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan's capital city has led to the marginalization of Kabul's interests as an urban center. So the city has become a symbolic epicenter of state building, national reconstruction, and is the primary locus of international presence in the country. Yet ironically, the city itself is in dire straits. It has mushroomed in size, largely as a result of the civil war in the country. Yet international decision makers operate over the heads of municipal actors and local communities. And this is a phenomenon that Daniel Esser refers to as the overdetermination of urban governance. It's also illustrated in another one of our case studies, which was on Dili in Timor-Leste. Here the presence of international actors and activities created the illusion of endless employment and other opportunities which in fact were very fragile and very finite. And at the same time, policies and planning for sustainability were not put in place at the urban scale. Instead, urban planning became, in Timor-Leste, emphasis was put on neoliberal forms of reconstruction and development, and particularly at the national and rural level, didn't work, led to people flocking into the city, and the city couldn't cope because no one had paid attention to urban planning. A third way in which sovereign conflicts and cities become intertwined, and this is again an example from the work that I did myself in Afghanistan, was where international actors themselves became involved in urban planning. So the planning of Kabul was dominated by the military and coordinated by the military for military purposes. So all those are examples of urban realities that are often not seen because they lie behind what appear to be urban-biased reconstruction efforts, but they absolutely neglect the citizens of those countries. I've said probably a bit more about the role of cities in civil conflicts, and perhaps don't need to give you so many illustrative examples there. Except perhaps to share with you the case study from Gulu in northern Uganda, which shifted in the context of the war between the Ugandan state and the Lord's Resistance Army from a small provincial town to the second largest urban centre in Uganda within the space of just a few years. It's not, and what that is interesting about that is that we're not just talking about primate or capital cities, we're talking about small urban centres that burgeon under conditions of civil conflict. And we see this too in work that one of our partners did in Colombia, where he looked at the South Bolivar region of Colombia, and where all the small towns in that part of Colombia mushroomed in size as a result of the war, the civil war. Largely because people were in search of both security and livelihoods, as well as the fact that many of the military and paramilitary forces were floating elements that would move in and out of these urban centres. So it's somewhat counterintuitive that rapid urbanisation and urban stability go together when a civil war is raging nearby. And that's, I think, a key finding that's come out of our work. And it's confirmed also by Dennis Rogers' work on Nicaragua, historical work. During most of the 2 decades of guerrilla struggle in Nicaragua, until the final stages in the late 70s, and then again during the Contra War in the 1980s, military action was largely confined to the countryside. And the city